Welcome back to the And Also podcast. My name is Madison and I am your host. If you have watched any of my podcast episodes, it is very clearly a different vibe today. There's a lot for me to catch you guys up on. First of all, new location. So for a while I was shooting in studio and I decided that I didn't want to shoot in a studio anymore. I've done a lot to make my apartment feel very homey, very me, and just give the vibes of everything that makes me happy. I decided why not just shoot the podcast here? Because as much as I love the studio and the sound quality is probably way better and you won't hear background noise in the studio, I just feel like my apartment feels like the safest place in the world to me. It makes me feel calm. It makes having these conversations feel a lot more natural and just like two friends sitting down and talking, right? And I just like being able to do it here. I have access to my espresso machine, all my drink stuff. So for a drink of the day, it doesn't have to be something bottled. Like I can actually make drinks for my guests, which is something I enjoy doing. And then also have just me, like my touch in the space. So I'm going to be real with you. It's going to be a little bit of trial and error just to get down the right set, the right sound. I mean, I have a soundboard, I have a high quality mic, I have my camera, and we're just gonna do it. And if you guys have suggestions in terms of lighting or sound or whatever, let me know. I'm so open to hearing that because, you know, this is just a learning process for me, but ultimately I want the show to be the best I can for you and for you guys to feel connected and safe and heard and understood. And I just feel like me being in my safe space allows me to be a better advocate and host and conversationalist for you guys. So thanks for sticking it out these last few weeks where I haven't posted an episode. I'm really ready to be back in full swing, posting every Sunday, but I just needed a little break. I wanted to reset things. I wanted to build out a space. I had to wait for all the equipment to come in. I had to set it all up. I had to figure out lighting and just so many different things. So thank you for being patient and for coming back and listening. Also, I chopped my hair off. For those of you listening and not watching the video version on YouTube, just know my hair was like past my shoulders, like on my chest. Now it is like an inch above my shoulders, maybe even 2 inches above my shoulders. It's a little bob and it is so freaking cute. I'm literally obsessed with it. So those are just some of the changes, y'all. So before we get into today's episode, our topic today is, of course, about grief. Are you shocked? I am not. Today's episode, specifically when it comes to grief, is all about complicated grief and prolonged grief. And these are very real things, and I don't feel like they're very acknowledged, especially in Western society. Shocker. I feel like it's something that we need to talk about more because grief is not a 6-7 step process. You know, it can go on for your entire life. So it's a matter of like, how do we recognize that our grief is becoming complicated, and how do we know when it's time to reach out for help? How do we know that we need to reach out for help? How do we know what kind of help to reach out for? And how do we know that we are dealing with a type of grief that is complicated? So we're going to get into all that today. But before we do that, let's get into our drink of the day. Okay, so this drink probably looks really interesting if you're watching on video. If you're listening just to the audio version, it's like the color of a Bloody Mary. Not even kidding. This drink has been an obsession of mine for a while now, and it is the Chamberlain Coffee Strawberry Matcha Latte with oat milk. First of all, cutest packaging in the entire world. I'm actually so obsessed. And all you do is you take a scoop of this, 2 tablespoons, and you add 6 ounces of water and you whisk it together. You can drink it like that if you want, as is. It's literally a ready-made strawberry matcha latte, which I know so many of you would literally be obsessed with. Strawberry is one of my favorite flavors, but the way that I drink this is a little different than that. What I did was I did a scoop of the matcha, mix it with some water, and then top it off with tart cherry juice and any flavor of seltzer. I topped it off with lime seltzer today. So this is strawberry matcha with cherry juice and just a little bit of bubbly. Yeah, that is how I've been drinking this. I love it. It gives me a good amount of an afternoon caffeine pickup without being too much like coffee, because usually it's about 4 o'clock right now. I would usually have a whole other cup of coffee, but I've been trying to do matcha after like 2 p.m. So be proud of me. This is so good. And I just love adding tart cherry juice to things lately. It just has this like bitter, sweet, zesty sort of taste. It's so good. And mixing it with like a creamy matcha, you wouldn't think it'd be good, but I promise you this is amazing and you need to try it. Chamberlain Coffee just always knows what they're doing. I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to tell you. Chamberlain Coffee is hands down one of my favorite places to get drink essentials. So next up, we have the book of the week. So if you don't know already, each week I pick out a book that has to do with the topic of the podcast episode. I share it with you, share my review, my thoughts, and just give you book recommendations every week, because who doesn't need a good book recommendation? So this week's book is called The Language of Loss, Poetry and Prose for Grief and Celebrating the Love of Your Life. This is a kind of poetry and very short story book. It's a easier, digestible read. I know for a lot of people who are in the early stages of their grief journey, it can be really hard to read. Like, reading doesn't process in your head. For me, I actually found that reading was the only thing I could do. Like, I couldn't do anything else. I couldn't even like watch a movie. So if you're kind of trying to get back into reading after experiencing a major loss, a lot of poetry books are going to be definitely easier to process because they're just shorter. You can kind of fragment them. You can read 1 or 2 poems and call it a day. And they're super relatable and they make you feel close to the person that you lost. So this one is by Barbara Abercrombie. It is about her husband who died. It's quite literally her finding words for that loss. And I think it just offers the reader such an understanding of the grief experience, especially for someone who has lost a significant other. So I'll just read you a very, very short one. This is called Grief Without Fantasy. What I lost was not going to happen. I had what happened. There was no more. And I love that, because when you lose someone, there's a huge part of you that tries to imagine all these things that would have happened. And it's one of the most difficult things in the grief process. And I remember telling myself early on, like, this is what you have. This is what you experience. There is no more. And once you kind of grasp that very concept, it becomes, I wouldn't even say easier, I wouldn't say whatever, but it becomes more digestible for you to kind of understand that this is the reality. So I love that poem. And these poems it's a collection. It's kind of all different authors that helped her get through the loss of her husband. She put together this incredible collection of writing. So I love this. I think books like this are really wonderful for people who are trying to get back into reading in the grieving process, or just looking for something comforting and relatable, because you'll find it here. So now that we have all of that out of the way, let's get into today's topic, complicated grief and when grief becomes prolonged or intense. So I personally would say that I am somebody who has experienced complicated grief. I'm currently in the throes of complicated grief. And that has been really, truly the hardest thing I've ever experienced in my life. So with complicated grief, so if you don't know already, I lost my ex-partner of 6 years in 2022, the end of 2022, to suicide. He battled schizophrenia for a long few years, and it was a really, really difficult thing for everyone in his life, and dealing with the grief of that has been tremendously difficult. And he is so foundational to who I am. You know, we started dating when I was 14 and we were dating until I was 20, and it was like we went to prom together. I was there when he got his license. He was there when I got my license. We graduated high school. We started college. We started our careers. We really discovered who we are in the process of being there for each other for everything. And losing somebody that is so foundational is so intensely world shifting. The grief has certainly been complicated. So I want to start by kind of defining complicated grief. So complicated grief, also known as prolonged grief disorder, is a persistent and intense form of grief characterized by an inability to accept the loss, overwhelming feelings of sadness, yearning, or emptiness, and difficulty moving forward in life. It can significantly impair daily functioning and typically last longer than expected, hindering the individual's ability to adapt to life without the deceased person. Of course, there are factors of grief that exist for everyone, and they don't necessarily make it complicated grief. Complicated grief exists in situations in which your ability to function in life is so dependent on your grief. And that is a really difficult thing because in our society, grief is not seen appropriately, to be honest. We certainly don't take grief seriously. We don't recognize it as being something that people need space and time for, and they need healing and they need support. We kind of see it as a brush it under the rug, get back to work, you're going to go through these stages and you're going to be good to go, and we'll call it a day. And quite frankly, that is just not how grief works. If you ever experienced grief, you know that it's not just like pull yourself up by the bootstraps and keep going. It's not that simple. In fact, it's not simple at all. Factors that contribute to complicated grief usually, and this is never a blanket statement and in all cases, so there are certain factors surrounding the death experience that can contribute to complicated grief. Now, this by any means does not mean that every complicated grief case has to do with a loss like this. You can have an expected loss, you can have ambiguous grief, you can have a prolonged death that, results in complicated grief. But more often than not, complicated grief usually, not in all cases, is due to a sudden loss, a traumatic circumstance loss. So for example, a suicide, a car accident, a murder, or a loss where there are unresolved issues between the deceased and the person who is alive grieving. There are a lot of common symptoms of complicated grief. The first is a persistent yearning and longing for the deceased. And I kind of want to emphasize the word persistent because I think everyone who's grieving experiences a longing, a yearning for that person. I mean, of course, grief, that's a huge piece of grief. But this persistence of it is what kind of complicates things because it's on your mind 24/7. It's in everything you do. You literally cannot function without yearning for this person. You cannot enjoy anything in life without yearning for this person or thinking this would be better if, Regis was here. This would be a better experience. I feel like I can't live my life because I am longing for him to be a part of this. And that is such a hard thing. I dealt with that through the first probably year and a couple months. It was really difficult because it really makes you feel hindered in your ability to experience joy in anything. Regis died in November. I graduated in May of the following year, and I felt like the whole graduation, I could not get him out of my mind. I felt guilty. I felt this longing to have him there, to be able to tell him my accomplishments. It was so difficult to enjoy any sort of celebratory times. So the next common symptom of complicated grief is intense feelings of sadness, sorrow, and emptiness. I mean, I think, that feeling, that sinking feeling in your stomach when you first get that call that your loved one has died. It's like that feeling just never, ever getting lighter for like such a long time. And I felt that feeling like makes your heart race. It makes you feel numb. It makes you feel sick to your stomach. It makes you feel like you cannot get up off the couch. That feeling persisting for a certain amount of time. The feeling of that initial shock of grief just kind of staying with you alongside the sorrow and the pain, the suffering of grief, just being there for, it's common for you to feel those things. It's normal for you to feel those things. But when it reaches a point where those things are not getting any lighter, that becomes a complicated form of grief. So the third symptom of complicated grief is difficulty accepting the death or believing it's real. And this is a very, very hard one. I'm going to share something a little personal here that I kind of struggled with. So for the first probably 6 months of losing Regis, I really struggled to imagine him not being here. I knew he was dead. I have his ashes. I have seen them with my own eyes. I know he's not here. But there was like a part of my brain that still very much believed that he was out there somewhere. And I would literally have dreams of like me going out into the forest and like looking for him, like knowing he was out there, but I just could never find him. And it was just such a metaphor for what I was really feeling of like these thoughts of just like, there's no way he's not here. Like, there's no way. Like, they literally got the wrong guy. So Regis had a viewing and I didn't go. And I didn't even know it was happening at the time because I was not in direct contact with this family at the time of the viewing. And it's nobody's fault. I wish I went, because I think that would have kind of helped me solidify in my head that he was not here anymore. And I think that's why there's such an importance on going to a funeral or a wake. And I understand now why families choose to have open caskets, where like before I didn't understand it. And I was like, I don't need to see that. But now I'm like, I wish I did see that. I wish I had the opportunity to see him one more time and to just know and be very at peace with the fact that he is not here. So that is something I really struggled with. The next common symptom of complicated grief is preoccupation with thoughts or memories of the deceased. So like you are replaying things nonstop in your head, and it becomes almost obsessive, reliving stories, reliving moments, reliving the death, the thought of the death over and over for a very prolonged amount of time. Next, we have avoidance of reminders of the loss. So things you may not be able to face, maybe avoiding going into their room, maybe avoiding going through their belongings, maybe avoiding driving down their street, maybe avoiding passing by the site of an accident or a location where the death took place, fear of going anywhere near the funeral home that they were taken care of at. This might even mean not wanting to look at pictures of them, not wanting to talk about them, not wanting to go through the difficult memories or even some of the good memories of them. Just avoiding the topic of the loss at all costs because you do not feel ready to handle it or you're in denial about it. Next, difficulty of trusting others or forming new relationships. Oh girl, this one was probably the biggest struggle for me. I was so afraid of being close to people after losing Regis because I literally felt as if this would happen to them too, and I would have to go through this again. And I almost developed like a fear of getting close to people because I could not bear the thought of having to grieve them too. And I still struggle with this in my head. Every time I meet a new person, one of the first things that comes into my head is I'm going to have to deal with their death one day. And that is a very loud thought. My boyfriend and I, we got a kitten about 7 months ago, and I talk about it all the time. I'm like, wow, one day we're gonna have to put Geo down, or Geo's gonna die, or it's so crazy, we just got this cat and then it's gonna be with us for however many years and it's just gonna die and we're gonna have to deal with that. And it's like that thought is on repeat about anyone or anything new in my life. I'm like, oh my god, I'm gonna lose this one day, and it is a huge scary thing. Next is that you feel numb or detached from others. This one, 1,000,000% for me. I feel like it's never going to change. And I hate saying that because I want to be encouraging, but oh my God, it is so dark. It is so dark. Constantly feeling like you're outside of everything you're experiencing because your brain is so stuck in the world of grief that you cannot be present, and you just feel like you are living on a different planet than everyone else in the room. It is so difficult. It's unbearably hard. Honestly, this has been one of the hardest parts too of grief. Next common symptom is difficulty carrying out daily activities or maintaining routines. Now for me, I've had to put a major emphasis on maintaining a routine because the second I'm not in a routine is the second that everything starts collapsing very, very quickly, and it almost becomes seemingly impossible to put it all back together. So carrying out daily activities or maintaining routines, it can be so hard for people in the deep throes of grief, but it's also very, very vital for keeping yourself afloat. So it's like the hardest thing, but also one of the most important things you can do to take care of yourself. And then another common symptom is persistent feelings of emptiness or meaninglessness. And I have to say, the feeling of meaninglessness and emptiness for me, it was one of the most intense feelings I've ever dealt with. It wasn't just like, life feels so meaningless and like we're just on a floating rock. No, I mean, this was dark. This was very much, life is meaningless. There is no reason for me to keep going. Trigger warning right now for just like SI. In my head, it was like, okay, I'm going to die anyways in like 70 years or something. Might as well just get it over with now because I'm still going to be dead. The outcome's going to be the same, whether I die now or in 70 years. And I just saved myself 70 years of suffering because this grief is too much. And I can't bear to see a world without Regis in it. And that is a horrifying thought to have on your mind every single day. You know, fighting it, trying to find one reason just to stick around for one more day. So that one for me is just, it was a nightmare. In recognizing your own symptoms of complicated grief, now what? You know, what do you do? And I think there's such an importance of self-awareness in grief, as hard as it can be. The good thing about this is that in grief, you're usually very self-aware. You're usually thinking of things you may have never allowed your mind to think about before. You're usually in a very deep place in your mind, and you're really considering your life and your experiences. So it is a time of self-reflection for sure. As hard as that self-reflection can be, it certainly, grief puts you there. Grief puts you in the depths of self-reflection. Just kind of knowing that there is support out there. And I have a million resources for grief support. If you do live in my area in upstate New York and you are facing grief, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I have been connected with so many incredible grief professionals and people who, you know, focus on grief healing for a living. I've had some incredible grief healing experiences myself, and I certainly wouldn't be where I am today in my journey without some of these experiences. So if you're in my area and you're looking for grief specialists, please reach out. I think also with complicated grief, there's like a lot of societal factors that influence our behaviors when it comes to grief and how we handle it. Like even in my family, you know, my mom lost her dad at a very, very young age. Just the time she grew up, like they didn't talk about it. I feel like it's very important now that we're having these conversations and getting this stuff out there, because truly we all deserve a space to talk about our grief, but culturally and societally, we have not always been granted that. You know, there's grief in this world every single day, whether it's us personally experiencing it, our friends, our family, watching shit go down on the news. There is grief everywhere. To live in a world where we get to support each other is the best possible scenario. So there's a lot of impacts of complicated grief, like a lot. And obviously there's impacts of the initial death and how it impacts your life and shifts your reality. There's impacts of grief in general that we kind of deal with really forever. I mean, there is no like end line with grief, and that's why I kind of almost find it weird to call grief a journey, because a journey implies that you will end up somewhere, but this is a like ongoing thing, right? It's an ongoing experience. But with complicated grief, there's a lot of impacts that a lot of people don't see and we may not even recognize in ourselves. The first one being our emotional well-being, our physical health, our social function, our work or academic performance. There's a risk of mental health disorders developing over time, overall quality of life just like shifting. There are so many things, so many areas of our lives that grief impacts, and there's huge risk factors involved. Suicidal ideation is one of those things. Like when we lose somebody, it can be really hard to stay afloat. It can be really hard to decide to stay here every day, and I hear that and I understand that. And it's really hard. And a lot of people will develop anxieties, different types of anxiety after losing somebody they love, because they might fear, losing their own life, for example, and they don't want to leave the house. They become fearful of leaving the house. They might develop social anxiety because they feel like they don't fit into circles anymore because of this unique experience that they have. There's a huge percentage of people who develop depression, especially seasonal depression, and seasonally that would correlate to the time of year that their person died. It's really, really tough, and all of these things, without good social support, with a history of mental health issues, with a traumatic loss, with unresolved relationship issues, all of these symptoms of grief are just amplified so much more. And I just do want to talk about traumatic loss for a moment, because I am very much a survivor of different types of traumatic loss in my life. So it's sudden, unexpected, or violent deaths, such as accidents, suicides, or homicides, which can intensify grief reactions like incredibly, and it increased the risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder or complicated grief. And for me, I am diagnosed with CPTSD, but living with PTSD is a very, very difficult thing, especially coupling that with grief and with a suicide loss. Suicide loss is so traumatic and comes with so many layers of grief that I want to make a whole episode on this, and I would love to have a guest who has experienced suicide loss come on and talk about this with me. But suicide loss is a really complicated way to lose somebody, and so in turn, your grief is already complicated. I think also something else is like, if you experience multiple losses in a short period of time, I feel like we don't talk about that often. Your coping resources become overwhelmed at that point. There is so much grief existing. There is so much to process. There is so much what ifs. There's so many unanswered questions, and that is incredibly difficult. So if you are experiencing multiple losses in a short amount of time, I am just beyond sorry. And if those were, tragic, traumatic losses, complicated grief can be validly present with those experiences. And I feel like we just don't talk about them enough, because people don't want to hear the gruesome or the difficult or the tragic things that happen in everyday life, and that's really hard for those people who are living in the aftermath of that. So I think it's really just so important to acknowledge those people who are experiencing those things, and just let you know that there's space to feel that, and there is peace to be found, and life may never be the same, but there is definitely moments where you can find peace again. Let's talk about coping strategies and support systems, and just like reaching out for help and finding outlets to support you in the grief process. So my experience with getting help was a bit complicated, because I had a lot of pressure from people in my life who were encouraging me to get into support groups and, get a therapist and do all these things shortly after Regis's passing. And that for me was really hard, because I had yet to even process the fact that he died, and I had people pushing me to join a group and whatnot. And then so I did, because I thought they had my best interest in mind, and maybe they did. But when joining this group, it brought a lot more trauma and fear and intense feelings into my life, because I found myself setting my own needs aside and just wanting to be there for the people in the group. And it was so hard for me to focus on my needs in that moment, and I wound up taking on the problems of so many other people that were experiencing grief and suicide loss, and it was really hard. So my advice here is, don't avoid help, but get help at a pace that works for you. Sometimes getting into therapy right away is the best thing somebody can do. It keeps them afloat. Everyone has a lived experience that makes sense for them, and you have to do what's right for you. But for me, getting into a support group right away was certainly not the best idea, and it actually set me back in my healing journey a lot. But everyone is going to be different in regards to their healing process and the pace in which they decide to take that. I think seeking support from friends and family, if you have people in your life that are accessible to you, that you can trust and you can be open and honest with, that is really the place where you're gonna feel the safest. I wound up moving back home after I graduated college, because I mentally I couldn't be on my own at that time. That was such a great life-changing decision. I leaned on my friends so much, and even though they didn't understand exactly what I was going through, and they haven't dealt with a loss like mine, they did so much for me in ways that other people that don't know me could never have done. I mean, one of my close friends, Min, he painted this incredible incredible portrait of Regis. It was like one of the most beautiful moments I can think of in that awful dark time, like just getting that painting from him and like being so taken aback by the fact that somebody would do that for me. You know, like things like that, little moments where, you know, if you are vulnerable with your friends and you let them into the world of grief that you are dealing with, they just want to help you and they just want to be there for you. So allow them to support you. Something else, and I have a whole podcast episode about grief tips and how to kind of survive a loss. And if you want like more detail on, you know, coping, that is a really awesome episode to watch. But I think just keeping a daily routine, something that helped me was journaling, like having a Regis journal where I just write to Regis whenever I feel like I need to. That was the most helpful thing in the beginning, and now I do it a little bit more sporadically, but in the beginning that was so helpful. Maintaining basic self-care habits like making sure you're getting enough sleep, brushing your teeth, taking a shower. I know to some people who may not have ever dealt with this, that sounds so stupid that I would even have to suggest that, but when you're in it, you're in it. And you're not thinking about how many days it's been since you washed your hair. Definitely consider seeking professional help, whether it's a one-on-one therapist, a grief support group. There are so many free support groups out there too, just for people who want that community. The one that I went to, it was a wonderful, fantastic group. And if I were to go to it when I was ready, it would have been so helpful. It was the Samaritans of NYC. They have a suicide survivor grief support group that is accessible online and in person, I believe now, and is completely free. How amazing is that? Also, another thing is participating in activities that bring you joy that maybe your loved one enjoyed when they were here, to help you feel connected to them, and just celebrating them through memorial. So however you choose to memorialize them, keep that in your routine. Keep them here as much as you can. So those are just some tips on, you know, grief, but especially if you feel that you are struggling with complicated grief, I think it's so important to reach out for help, whether that is a friend, a peer, a teacher, a trusted adult, or a professional like a therapist, a counselor. There's also alternative forms of grief therapy. There's like meditations and yoga for grieving people. There are dance classes for grieving people. There are resources through your local funeral homes. And that is something I did not know until recently. And I think that we should all kind of be educated on that. If you are looking for resources to help survive your grief and learn to kind of move through it, reach out to your local funeral home and they will have resources for you. At least they should, if they're a good, caring funeral home. So that concludes this episode on complicated grief. I hope at the very least you learned a little bit more about what complicated grief is and how it can impact those around you or you yourself. I hope it's helped you maybe identify some areas where you're struggling in your own grief and some things you can do to kind of help yourself to move through this a little bit easier. I know it's not easy. I know it feels impossible most days. I know that especially in those beginning months, you know, things like anniversaries, holidays, just days that you're supposed to be celebrating feel way heavier. I can't ever promise you that you're going to wake up and, you know, never think about your person again. I can say for at least myself that I've found ways to make this livable. I found ways to build meaning into my life. I found ways to heal from some of the really, really dark parts of this loss, and I know that you can too. It will never be the same. Your life will never be what it was before the loss, but that doesn't mean your life can't be beautiful, enjoyable, and super livable. So thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you are watching on YouTube, definitely subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and leave a comment about which part of grief has been the most challenging for you, and if you've been able to overcome it, definitely let us know how you've overcome it, because community and mutual support is everything. Collective grief is such a real thing, and if we can all feel together, it makes feeling for the individual so much easier. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, be sure to definitely send this episode to a friend you think needs to hear it. Give the show a follow. And of course, leave a review on the show. I would love to hear how the And Also podcast has helped you through your mental health journey. If you liked it, give it 5 stars. It really helps me out, helps us continue having these conversations, which are just so important to destigmatizing mental health struggles. So thank you guys again for watching or listening, and I will see you in my next episode next week. Bye, guys.